I'm going to go off script and introduce Chaz Freeman the way I want to introduce Chaz Freeman. That's the fun part. He has held a number of very significant positions, both in the State Department and in the Defense Department, where he was Assistant Secretary of State for International Security Affairs, which is the most interesting job in the State Department. But the two things that are striking about his career, one speaks to the very beginning of his career when he was first joined the Foreign Service and had an extraordinary ability when it came to languages, and ended up on the China desk and ended up being the translator for Richard Nixon during the 1972 visit that changed our world. And so I'll be curious to get his sense of what he learned from that experience. But the second moment in history that I find most interesting about Chaz Freeman, I'm sure there are many others, but the one that captures me is that he was our ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the run-up, and I guess during the first Gulf War, which was perhaps in our more recent adult lifetime an extraordinary moment of diplomacy. You know, the way diplomacy is supposed to work. And so you see this, this great breakthrough of 1972 and this extraordinary moment in the late 80s, early 90s, really. And the final thing I want to say about Chaz Freeman is most of the things he's done is right, but he's done something terribly wrong, and that he's robbed California of Margaret Carpenter. Margaret is his wife and now lives on the East Coast, but she used to be a Californian, so we're grateful to him for coming back with Maggie as well. So thank you for indulging me there. So I thought we would cover, you are remarkable in many ways, but I think the most extraordinary thing is that you are a deep expert in both China and in sort of Levant and the Middle East and the Gulf region. And so I'm going to try to cover both if we can, starting with sort of the great power reality in our relationship with China, and then going on to the part of the world that has our attention most. You write in one of your books that we should be able to or we should always put ourselves in the other one's shoes to understand why they think the way they do and see things the way they do. So I'm going to ask that you do that with the Chinese leadership right now and talk a little bit about what Xi's vision is of China's role, first economically, and then we'll move on to politically and in security terms.
Well, I think you're right. The basis of diplomacy is empathy, not sympathy. The difference is understanding where people are coming from does not mean agreeing with them necessarily. And we're in a very interesting period in which externally China's on a roll. The United States has abdicated responsibility for rulemaking internationally with regard to key issues like climate change and trade and investment liberalization. And China's been sucked into this void. And I don't know whether it's up to the task or not, but at the moment all eyes are on China to address these issues which the United States no longer apparently wishes to address. But at the same time, China domestically is in many ways reverting to authoritarian rule. It's very nervous and ill at ease. The leadership, which is preparing for another party congress soon, is apparently feeling vulnerable. And China's behaving in a sort of passive-aggressive fashion in many respects domestically. Now, having said all of that, I would say, and this is a key point that putting yourself in Chinese shoes illustrates, we have a completely, to my mind, established and not terribly realistic about a narrative about China. China is, quote, assertive. China is taking over this, that, and the other. If you look at this from the Chinese point of view, South China Sea, for example, it was Vietnam that militarized the land features there. Vietnam occupies 33 land features, rocks, some of them underwater at high tide, small islands. It was the one that began to build islands. It was the one that first incorporated a South China Sea municipality. China belatedly reacted. But of course, Vietnam is not a great power. So what is involved here is indeed great power dynamics. And typically on the Chinese and on the American side, there are mutual misperceptions, fears, apprehensions. We look at the Chinese and we see a people who are returning, have returned perhaps to wealth and power, and actually have an industrial economy that's 1.5 times ours. You know, there are these gross comparisons of GDP. They really don't mean much. But the fact that China produces half, again, what we do industrially is really telling. We've been the paramount economy in the world since sometime around 1875, 1880. That's a long time. We're losing that status. We're very uncomfortable with that. The Chinese look at us and they remember the Korean War, they remember the Cold War, they remember blockades, they remember embargoes and sanctions, they remember pressure, they remember the issue of Taiwan. Their country is divided as a result of our intervention. And they see us in the South China Sea aggressively trying to dislodge them, apparently, from places that they think are part of their country. So we have a spiraling tension in this relationship, and it's really quite dangerous.
Dangerous in what way? Do you imagine it coming? You know, there was a warning, in fact, I think it was in today's paper reported that there was a group of experts under the aegis of the Asia Society saying, look, take care, don't get into a trade war, but it also seemed to be saying, and don't get into a military conflict. Do you see any risk of that?
I think China is primarily an economic challenge. But we've made it into a military challenge because that's who we are. We have a very militarized perspective on the world. There's something called the security dilemma, in which each side misperceives the other's actions as offensive, when each side is, in fact, trying to counter and defend itself against the other side. We're in the middle of that. Let me give you a speculative example, because I can't prove this. But many years ago, I asked the then president of China, Hu Jintao, whether in response to American ballistic missile defense programs, China would build a larger number of warheads and ICBMs. And I thought his answer was very wise. He said, the purpose of nuclear weapons is not to be used. Why would you build one more thing that you don't want to use than you have to? So we will keep with the minimal deterrent that we have. I note that our president now says, if you spend the money to build these things, you should be able to use them. Very different mentality, which I don't agree with. But in any event, the $1 trillion that the Obama administration committed to nuclear modernization, the tweet by the incoming president arguing for even more, although it's not clear what he meant, plus the reopening of the Taiwan issue between us and the Chinese, I think I'm seeing straws in the wind. I can't prove it. I think have brought the Chinese to decide that 45 or 60 ICBMs are not enough to deter the United States. They need to be able to annihilate us to do that. So we are, I think, in the process of bringing into being another existential threat to this country on a scale comparable to that of Russia. There was no need for that.
I think they went for a very long time with something like 50 nuclear weapons, truly a minimal deterrent, and now are more like 290 or something. But
well, I think
still,
the numbers are very questionable. I've heard from some Chinese friends that, in fact, our estimates may be low. The fact is they've just deployed another regiment of ICBMs up in the northeast and Manchuria, and they did so very visibly. Obviously, they wanted us to notice. And when you listen to Xi Jinping and others, they say, look, we want good relations with you. We don't want to have a war. We don't want to fight. We don't want conflict. But we also have our pride, and we will not yield to pressure.
Right. So let's take it back to your earlier comments about their role in the global economy, because there has been a decision to open and connect the economy. They've had experienced terrific growth and a great growth of the middle class, very importantly. First, internally, they're also experiencing great disparities of wealth in a society that values equity highly. What are the implications of that? Is there dangers when it comes to social cohesion, resentment, if these disparities continue to grow?
Well, I think inequality of income distribution, which we have, of course, now in our own country, is dangerous politically. It is inherently unsatisfactory, and it invites agitation for political change. And that is true in China, and it's particularly true perhaps because the Chinese are now going through a massive transition, or attempting to go through it. It's not clear they're really going to make it through it, from an economy which was based almost entirely on investment-driven growth to one which is based on domestic consumption. Actually, if you look at the economy, you will see, I read part of the study from the Asia Society that you mentioned, and there was a statement in there which is the normal sort of statement about China that's no longer true. They talked about China's great dependency on exports. China's dependency on exports is shrinking rapidly. Domestic consumption is already what is driving the economy. Anyway, they're trying to do this, and it involves stepping on a lot of important toes and upsetting a lot of vested interests, and it's politically, therefore, extremely difficult. And I think it explains some of what I would consider to be excessive emphasis on political control that the Xi Jinping government has been insisting upon.
And what is your expectation at the Party Congress? Is it in October? I'm not sure when it is, but it's coming up soon.
Well, it should be in the fall, probably October. That's usually when it is. Well, I think it's very unclear. That is, we'll probably have more indication a little later in the spring, because there will be preliminary meetings. But the fact is that after Deng Xiaoping's revolution, the real revolution perhaps, the one that propelled China from poverty and isolation into wealth and global influence, after that revolution, the Chinese have evolved a political system which is not democratic, but which seems to arrange orderly successions, and which relies on a kind of collective leadership where many voices can be heard and issues can be debated. Xi Jinping seems to have concentrated very much power in his own hands. He's the head of virtually every major policy-making organization in the party and the government. And the question for the fall is, and the Party Congress is, will this be consolidated? There will be changes of personnel. Will he be able to put in people who are his supporters rather than people of strong will who argue with him, which has been the case? Will we see the emergence of a China that is, in fact, more dictatorial rather than less? I think those are some of the issues.
You referred to our sort of ceding our own leadership role, certainly in trade, backing away from the TPP. Here was an agreement involving something like 40% of the world's GDP, 11 countries. China was excluded. It was an effort to ensure that we wrote the rules of the road. We've stepped away from that. Xi seems to be stepping forward with his own approach to international, regional trade. And then you mentioned to climate change as well. How does the political system around him react to this potentially really important global role, regional role, but ultimately global role he's playing?
Oh, I think there's a great deal of pride among ordinary Chinese in the prestige that their country has now captured. I want to go back, though, if I may, because it's easy to focus on the decision of the Trump administration to adopt an America First policy. America First is a very problematic approach to international affairs. Just think about it. Think about it in terms of leadership. If you're a lieutenant and you want your platoon to charge a hill and you say, I only care about me, I don't care about the rest of you, I wonder how many people are going to follow you. If you say no multilateral agreements because they compromise our bargaining power, so we're only going to do bilateral agreements, you're basically saying we're not going to do rulemaking anymore. This is what TPP claimed to be doing. I was frankly never convinced. We have, I think, we are in the process of abdicating a role that we've had at least since 1945, it's very odd. The Chinese look at this with perplexity. Why is the United States dismantling so much of its international influence? What is the benefit of that? I don't know if I've answered your question. Maybe I've lost the track.
So let me take you to that moment in 1972. As translator, give us a sense of what the dynamic looked like to you, your sort of understanding of the strategic choice that was being made, how it was being received within China. I'd be curious of, were there politics in China regarding this this détente, and politics within the United States? One, put yourself into the mind of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and others, but two, then speak a little bit about the politics on both sides.
Well, I joined the United States Foreign Service in 1965 out of the Harvard Law School, and I did so for many reasons. I wanted to serve my country. It was the Kennedy inspiration era. When I looked at diplomacy as a career, it seemed to me that the geopolitical arrangements in the world were irrational, that we had a conflict with the Soviet Union, two countries at each other. There was a third country, which had once been a Soviet ally, that had ended, and I thought we would have to reach out to them for support. And I thought it would be fascinating to be there, and I had become fascinated with China, and I was lucky enough to be there. So there was no doubt in my mind about the strategic geopolitical significance of what Richard Nixon persuaded Henry Kissinger to do. And it really was that way. Despite the fact, this is the other point, I had read Kissinger's masterly dissertation, A World Restored is the name of the book, which is about the balance of power in Europe and the period from the Concert of Vienna to World War I, basically, which was a period of peace. And one of the great themes in that book and in that diplomacy was basically pulling the fangs of revolutionary destabilizing powers. And I thought that's what we should be doing with China. There was clear what the significance of it was. I don't think the American people understood that particularly. They understood that we were in a rivalry with the Soviet Union and we were recruiting a new ally, because we don't use that word very precisely in that struggle. In China, this was enormously controversial. In fact, it led to an attempted coup d'etat by Lin Biao, who was the military leader who was most identified with Mao. And he died in an air
I
crash
was going to say he didn't fare well.
in Mongolia. And I can remember in Hangzhou, in particular, during the visit, being seated at a table, well, it was at the head table, but round table, next to a bunch of People's Liberation Army generals who had fought in the Korean War. And I started asking them about their experiences and so forth. And there was a real tension in the room. And I managed, in China, when you drink at a table, you match everybody. So I basically got them all drunk, and and they got up and went around the table very gauchely, improperly, and said to Premier Zhou Enlai, who was the other side of the table, we haven't seen you since that unfortunate business, and we want to pledge allegiance. Well, there was dead silence on the Chinese side, because they were revealing their dirty laundry, which was that a lot of people in China were not happy about Richard Nixon, not him particularly, but the President of the United States coming to China and Mao accepting this gesture. So it was controversial on both sides, I think, not terribly well understood. And there were all sorts of silly things that happened. American conservatives went to China, and they saw a lot of people with short hair who sat up straight at their school desks and saluted the teacher. And they thought, wow, this is the perfect society. And in fact, it was an amazingly illiberal, rather nasty place at that time. It got a lot better as time went on.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to now take you to the Levant, to the other part of the world, because I love your description of charging up the hill as a leader with no one wanting to follow. And you think of the first Gulf War, and it was all about collective action. I mean, what George H.W. Bush was seeking to defend was the notion of sovereignty, the notion that you do not, through military force, violate sovereignty. So it was an interest that all states shared. Right? Talk a little bit about the process of building that coalition. That couldn't have been easy, even though it was in everyone's interest, the ultimate objective.
Well, there were multiple coalitions, and that's one of the reasons that there was no war termination strategy, and the war never really ended, which is a tragic waste of men's lives and
Did you feel
treasure.
that Bush should have chased Saddam into?
No, absolutely
okay.
not. I will recount that moment if you want. I don't think I've done so publicly. But just to go back to your original opening, there were really 2 points. One was exactly the point you made, that the Cold War had finished. We were clearly entering a new era. A new world order was the phrase. And we didn't want that order to begin with a precedent that a large country could swallow a small one with impunity. And there are lots of small countries in the world who feel rather strongly about that. And so in one sense, it wasn't hard to organize the United Nations to basically issue a writ, a legal order, allowing us to form a posse and go after the miscreant. That worked. And this was really the first time that the United Nations worked the way it was conceived by Roosevelt and others. That's one point. The other point was that the Persian Gulf region has about 60% of the world's energy resources. And the idea of one country, one leader, Saddam Hussein, controlling all of that was pretty scary in terms of its implications for global economic prosperity and trade and investment. So the two things came together. Organizing the coalitions was not easy. First, we had a coalition between the White House and the Congress. The Congress was not enthusiastic about this. And in fact, the administration, I think, in retrospect, setting a very bad precedent, launched what we called Operation Tin Cup, where we went around the world and begged funds to fund the war, which we actually made money on, so that we wouldn't have to go through the congressional appropriation process. I mean, that was basically, getting the Congress not to obstruct the executive in constitutional terms was what this was about domestically. Well, that was pretty delicate. Then we had a coalition among the permanent members of the Security Council. Getting the Soviet Union, which still existed, was in the process of disappearing, to agree to work with us rather than against us was novel. Yeah. China doesn't like the idea of big countries invading other countries, whether they're big or little. And it was not easy to persuade them to abstain. The French had been the major arms suppliers to Saddam Hussein. And the French Minister of Defense was the president of the Franco-Iraqi Friendship Society. And the British had an unfortunate history in the Gulf. And so it wasn't easy to put that together. And then we had the Islamic dimension, because we were stationing troops, most of whom were not Muslim, in the most conservative, austerely puritanical Islamic society on the planet, Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis had a coalition of their own that they built, and they basically bankrolled the Desert Shield that stopped Saddam from advancing, and then Desert Storm, which evicted him from Kuwait. They went from zero national debt to 55% of GDP in 7 months. We bankrupted them, basically. Now the war ended. It didn't really end, as I said. It ended. There was a truce, February 28, 1991. There was a conversation between Colin Powell and Norm Schwarzkopf, my counterpart on the military side. I happened to be there, and it was a telephone conversation. Powell was in the Oval Office. Schwarzkopf was in Riyadh. And it went like this. Powell said, "I've been talking to the president who was there, and he was thinking about his reelection. And we like the sound of a 100-hour war. So we think we could end this at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at your time, and that would be 100 hours." Now, this is ridiculous on several levels. First of all, we had just had 42 days of one bomb a minute dropping on the Iraqis. The military are supposed to believe in jointness, but this was two army guys talking about the ground war. It's like, if you analyze the Super Bowl only in terms of what happened on the ground. So Norm Schwarzkopf said, "Well, if you gave me another 24 hours, I could further attrit the Republican Guard." And Colin Powell said, "We don't want another Wounded Knee." And Norm said, "Sure, okay." So that is how the war ended. On March 2nd, there was a meeting in southern Iraq at Safwan, to which the Iraqis were invited to send two generals, General Khalid bin Sultan from Saudi Arabia and Norman Schwarzkopf from The United States represented the coalition on the other side. They had no instructions, none. We tried to get instructions for them. You know, I thought the Iraqi generals must have been hard-pressed not to do cartwheels out of the tent, because they must have expected to go in there and be told, you are defeated, your foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, should report to Geneva on this date to discuss the terms of your capitulation. Limited wars end in limited capitulations. But instead there was no discussion of anything except technical matters. Where's the line of control? What do we do about missing in action? How do we deal with the wounded? You know, and the Iraqis said, well, can we fly helicopters in southern Iraq? And having no instructions, Schwarzkopf said, sure. So that's how history is made. It is, I think Talleyrand said that, you know, if everybody understood, there would be no history. That's one comment. And another is that history is a series of unplanned, unconsidered blunders. Yeah. And I think that's pretty much what we had. So the war never ended. We never insisted that Saddam Hussein accept the consequences of his defeat. There was no negotiation. Instead, the UN issued an order, a writ, a mandamus. You will do this, 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 this. And like any good deadbeat dad, the minute the court was out of session, he started cheating because he hadn't signed on to that. It was not a good way to end a war. So one of the things we should have learned from that is don't start a military action before you ask, and then what? Don't start a war unless you know how you're going to end it, on what terms, negotiated with whom. Most wars do not end in unconditional surrender. And they're about adjusting relationships, about modifying behavior. And apparently we don't understand that.
Well, that takes us to the Second Iraq War and to Libya in particular. But let me just ask one question that I started to ask you also. Your view, I mean, as you recall, there was enormous pressure to not just evict Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, upholding this concept of sovereignty, but to go further and to, in essence, to effect regime change, which would have been kind of counter to the initial purpose. What were the pressures then, and what was your thinking then? What did you feel was the right thing to do?
Well, I actually think then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney was entirely right. He made the best arguments against going to Baghdad. And subsequent events where he took the other position simply validated his arguments that you. So I was strongly against extending the war beyond. I don't think you move the goalposts. The UN and the coalitions that I'd mentioned had focused on liberating Kuwait. We had not focused on regime change in Baghdad, and I don't think we should have. In fact, to the extent there were clear war aims, they involved trimming the Iraqi forces to a level where they could once again be balanced by Iran, because we had depended for peace in the Persian Gulf on a balance between the two major powers there, and that enabled us not to have troops in the region. And when we violated that later with a policy of dual containment, we stuck ourselves in the Gulf. We're still there. We've got troops all over the place. We're involved. We can't get out. So I was strongly against mission creep, which is what that would have been. There were people who were for it, of course, but they certainly did not include many in the Arab and Islamic coalition who had assumed, nobody had bothered to correct their impression, that the liberation of Kuwait would involve invading Kuwait, not Iraq.
Yeah.
But of course, liberating Kuwait involved a flanking maneuver through Iraq and left us in control of everything south of the Euphrates. There were multiple pressures, but I thought the better course was the one we took.
Yeah. So this does take me to Libya, though, because there was a situation of mission creep, right? The original purpose was a responsibility to protect argument. The notion that if a leader tolerates or is even part of mass atrocities against their citizens, then the international community has not only the right to intervene, but perhaps the responsibility to do so. That was the argument for going into Libya. But with Russia's tacit agreement, I mean, it didn't get in the way. Let's put it that way, even though it was an ally of Libya's. Then it turned into regime change almost overnight. What was the impact of that mission creep, both on the way Russia looked at the world from then on, or looked at us from then on, but also on the effectiveness of the exercise to begin with?
Well, Libya has left us, of course it's not over because Libya is still in a state of anarchy, but Libya has left a number of very unfortunate legacies in the international system. One, Gaddafi had given up his weapons of mass destruction. The lesson to anybody who might be tempted to do so is don't, because then they'll come get you.
And of course, Ukraine had given up its nuclear weapons.
Exactly, but I'm thinking of North Korea, for example, which learned from the Libyan adventure that the only security is that which you hold in your own hands. International law is no longer a protection. Sovereignty is not respected. So that was one thing. The responsibility to protect principle, which had been advocated and was making some headway in terms of getting acceptance internationally, was destroyed by Libya. It will never be invoked again internationally because it turned out to be a subterfuge, and not a very subtle one, because as you said, it immediately became a very thin disguise for regime change. The issue of regime change, which never should have become a major element in any country's policy, in my view, has been greatly colored by the Libyan experience. Some have tried to apply the Libyan example to Syria, where we've been engaged somewhat fecklessly in attempting to engineer regime change, oddly enough in association with the groups that we have declared to be our main enemies in the Middle East. The result is something like 500,000 dead Syrians, 11 million displaced from their homes, that's half the population, 4 or 5 million people living outside Syria, an avalanche of refugees that has destabilized the European Union, and lots of other results one could talk about. The Russians and the Chinese, I think the Russians were always quite cynical about the United States. They looked at, for example, at the U.S.-NATO use of force to detach Kosovo from Serbia, very popular with the Kosovars, very popular in the United States, but totally without any international legal justification. They looked at that as evidence that we indeed believed that might made right, that we are not committed to a rule-bound order as we claim, and they then applied the precedent to Crimea. The Chinese perhaps were less cynical, more passionate about the issue of sovereignty and respect for it as the basis of the international order they want to see, as the basis of the UN Charter. And we now have the very strange situation in which if China's the enemy, they are who we used to be internationally. They're arguing for an open economy, an open order. They're arguing for the UN Charter. I mean, I find this absolutely astonishing given where they were when I first met them in 1972. And I also find it astonishing in terms of where we were, because we're now on, we are the revolutionary, destabilizing power. We're the ones pushing for radical change. Interesting.
So in Syria, what's happening right now is a combination of peace talks that don't involve us. They involve Russia, the Assad regime, Turkey. Military action on the ground, a kind of a squeezing out of ISIL or Daesh from the Aleppo province by a combination of the Turks, Hezbollah, the Russians. What is the outcome you see, and what is the best outcome?
You know, sometimes you have to make a choice. There was a brilliant British general involved in the Bosnian operation who said there are 3 rules for intervention in civil war. 1, don't. Second, if you do, pick the side that's going to win. And number 3, help them win fast. And I look at Syria from the beginning. I found it very difficult to understand what we hope to gain by overthrowing the Assad regime. Sure, it was a terrible regime. It is a terrible regime by our standards. Many Syrians don't like it. But a very large number of Syrians, it turns out, are more fearful of what might replace it than they are opposed to it. And Syria is an extremely complex country with many different religious tendencies and ethnicities. What's happened is the worst of all possible worlds, probably. The Assad regime is probably in a pretty good position to reassert control of most of Syria, and it will do so vindictively, which means a lot of Syrians who are outside Syria are never going home, and a lot of Syrians who are still alive may die unpleasantly. And we've spawned Daesh, the so-called Islamic Caliphate, which is not limited to a territory. It is a transnational movement now with footholds in many, many places. It has been a prime beneficiary of drone warfare in terms of its ability to build support locally. It turns out people don't like living under conditions where they might be killed from the sky by some yo-yo in Nevada. I think we come down in the end to Syria to this. The only party that has distinguished itself there is Mr. Putin and the Russians, with a very minimal commitment of force, around 5,000 troops, which is very small. Russia has accomplished the following. It has simplified the question in Syria, which involved hundreds of factions, to a choice between tyrannical secularism on the one hand and fanatical Islamism on the other. Which are you for? Do you want something like Daesh, or are you prepared to live with a government that is respectful of women and that is not religiously prejudiced, even if it may be dominated by a particular religious faction? Russia is back as a main actor in the Middle East. It has demonstrated that its weaponry is the sort of thing you might want to buy, and that is part of the objective. It has shown that, unlike the United States, which is fickle and which threw Hosni Mubarak overboard with an almost glee in a gleeful manner, that Russia will stand by its protégés, even when they're not nice people. Russia has made an alliance with Iran, well, probably an entente would be a better word. Again, alliances, we've lost the precision in diplomatic vocabulary. But let's say an entente, a limited understanding for limited purposes for a limited period. And we are sidelined. And finally, Russia has achieved an entente with the Turks, who were a mainstay of NATO. And again, we are not in it. So if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and that's where we are in the Middle East.
So one of the questioners asks about Turkey, so I actually would like to go there. Here we are, it is part of NATO. Back in the Clinton administration, we saw it as a big emerging market and thought that the best possible relationship was one of trade and investment and integrating Turkey into the global economy. We wanted to see it join the European Union. Now, it's clear that the Europeans don't want them in the European Union and maybe never did. It is dealing with the influx of refugees. And Mr. Erdogan is seeming less and less democratic by the minute. What do you see as the future of Turkey and our interest in Turkey? I mean, there it is, touching Europe, Asia, the Middle East, in a pivotal place.
Absolutely. There are two big developments in geopolitics. Russia and Turkey are both societies that wanted to redefine themselves as European, and they've been trying to do that for the last several centuries, and they've now given up. The Russians are stressing their own civilizational distinctiveness, and the Turks are looking to China and Central Asia and the Middle East rather than to Europe. This is a big thing. What is the importance of Turkey? Turkey, there's probably no country on the planet that touches on so many important interests. You simply cannot conduct policies toward a huge number of places or issues without the Turks either cooperating or acquiescing. What are those? Syria, to start with, Iraq, Iran, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Russia, NATO, Greece, Cyprus, the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, the Balkans, European Union expansion, the Organization of for Islamic Cooperation, 57 Muslim countries, and I probably have omitted a few things. I mean, it's an extraordinary list, and for a long time we neglected Turkey, and Turkey's in a position in which it can hurt us, and it feels it has reason to do so. I think, finally, however, I think it's truly sickening to watch Mr. Erdogan and his assaults on the Gulen movement, which are obvious concoctions of convenience rather than factually based.
That he's blaming for the coup attempt.
Yeah, I guess we're into alternative facts, and he's created a lot of them. And the collapse of Turkish, or the implosion of Turkish democracy, I should say. This is very disturbing. Turkey is a country that, if you have the chance to visit it, will enchant you.
A couple of the questions speak to the refugee crisis prompted. I mean, of course, this is not just Syrians. It's Iraqis, Afghanis, and others, Eritreans, and others. One asks, how is it that we can take the position that we won't be accepting them? Another asks, how could we be accepting fewer than a small country, relatively small country like Germany has? And the third one asks about the question, this is, I mean, let me try to rephrase it a bit, but this is sort of the second time that refugees Muslim refugees have poured into Europe in search of safety. It was true in Bosnia
Right.
Right? It was true within Europe. And there was also this difficulty in absorbing. What is the impact? How might they see our unwillingness and Europe's difficulty in absorbing them and welcoming them?
Well, of course, the great and terrible irony here is that, like Mr. Magoo, we wander through the world destroying things and imagining that we're achieving wonderful stuff. Those refugees are the product of our interventions in their societies that destabilized them. We were the ones who kindled the equivalent of the 30 Years' War within Islam that is now going on. We were the ones who destabilized Iraq. We were the ones who destabilized Syria and Libya and left them in a state of anarchy. We were the ones who, as a result of the collapse of Libya, spread weapons to Mali. We cannot be blamed for the chaos in Somalia, but we have not done much to improve it. And these are the places the refugees are coming from. And we accept no responsibility. As I say, Mr. Magoo, buildings fall down behind us, but we think we've done a great job.
Is our fear of admitting potential terrorists into our country, in fact, creating or contributing to the very danger that we're citing as our...
No, I mean, Islamophobia has become heavily institutionalized to the point that it helped win an election in this country. You cannot expect to defeat Daesh, the so-called caliphate, without Muslim allies. In the end, you must have people who are credible spokesmen for Islam to declare what is true, that it is a perversion of Islam. If I say that as a non-Muslim, it has very little credibility. And of course, if you, on the one hand, say, well, I need your help, and on the other hand, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I don't want you anywhere near me. Stay away. That doesn't work. So whether you approach this in terms of American history, this is a nation of refugees of one sort or another, immigrants, but people who came here mostly to get away from something else. And that's probably true, actually, of the original Native American population. But who knows? Anyway, it belies our history. It belies our moral standards. It belittles us. It's ugly. And it adds to the sense abroad that we've lost our way, that American exceptionalism, which really was admired to the extent that it embodied an aspiration for higher standards on the part of Americans, has gone. And that we are now not exceptional and not even ordinary, just pretty ugly.
You've been willing to be blunt on every subject, so I'm going to take you to this questioner who asks about the settlements on the West Bank, but more broadly notes that Mr. Trump's rhetoric has been very sort of pro-Israel at a time when the one-state solution seems to be slipping away.
Two-state solution.
Two-state solution. Yeah. Whoops.
One-state solution
is what's happening. Yeah. Is the two-state solution gone?
Yeah, I think it went a long time ago. I think it was a useful political device to keep the gullible on side, give the press something to talk about, give Mr. Netanyahu an instrument by which to do what magicians do, distract people while they pick their wallet or whatever. And I think it's gone. And I think it's foolish to pretend anything else. But having said that, the importance of solving this issue of what issue? achieving acceptance for a Jewish state in the Middle East, because it is not accepted, except by the people who expelled the Jews or did worse things to them. And it needs to get acceptance in its own region, number one. Number two, it needs to have borders. You cannot have a state that is continually taking whatever it wants from other people and has no borders. And the issue with the settlements, therefore, is crucial. If we are, in fact, Israel is now a country that has four classes of people. Israeli Jews who are full citizens, Arab Israelis who are second-class citizens in terms of allocations of funds and legal standing in many ways, people in the West Bank who are subjected to enormous harassment and oppression with a view to encouraging them to leave, and people in Gaza who inhabit a kind of open-air prison that is occasionally bombed and strafed. This is not a viable solution for the future. If this is the one state that Israel is constructing with our help, it is not going to survive. It's not going to survive because there are a lot of decent people in Israel who will leave. It is not going to survive because you cannot live 24 hours a day with your eyes open and a gun pointed at your neighbors. And we are completely identified with Israel, and this, therefore, is going to have huge implications for us, which is why I feel strongly about it. And I'll add one other point. We pay for it. You know, what the Syrians do to other Syrians is not paid for by us. What is being done to the inhabitants of Palestine, Jewish or Muslim or Christian, we're paying for. We're paying for it through tax subsidies as well as appropriations. And that makes us responsible. And that means we have a right and a responsibility to be critical. And the fact that we refrain from being critical is more a case of political intimidation than anything else.
I'm going to take you to one other topic that'll get you in hot water, and that is to talk a little bit about the current president's leadership. I'm going to draw an analogy that hasn't been drawn on the question cards, and that is, if you remember back in Nixon's day, there was a point at which he said, look, I want them to think I'm irrational. I want to keep them off guard. I want them not to know what my next move is. Let them think I'm crazy. Could that be the current strategy?
Well, there is that thesis, but to me, looking at the current White House operation as it's evolved so far, it looks like an octopus putting on socks. I don't think it's very purposive. And by the way, Nixon's madman theory didn't really work. But no, I think we're dealing with a very large, perhaps troubled personality with a great concern for himself, obviously, and a very thin skin, and impulses that flash out in tweets in the middle of the night. And I'm not sure that the replacement of policy papers by tweets is an intellectual advance or likely to benefit the country. But anyway, I think we all need to try to help this administration succeed because they're all we have. But I confess that I'm not convinced by the theory that this is all for show. I think a lot of the confusion represents more deep-seated problems.
Now, one of the questioners asked what you thought of the new Secretary of State. I would add to that the Secretary of Defense. These are both people who have run large operations. They're smart. They're well-informed. They may not come from, in General Mattis, he's a military man, not a policy man. Rex Tillerson comes out of the private sector. But one assumes these are capable individuals.
I think they
What
both
is-
are.
Yeah. You must know Mattis.
I do. I think he is an extremely thoughtful, principled, honest man. He's probably one of the best combat generals we've produced in decades. What he is not, he is a soldier's soldier. What he is not is a civilian. And the Secretary of Defense is the principal mechanism for civilian control of the military. So this is a bit of a gamble or something strange. The Secretary of State needs four qualities: conceptual ability, strategic thinking, management ability, because it's an extremely complex organization, not just in Washington, but spanning the world. And it's an organization that has been very badly managed for much of its history and therefore needs attention. The Secretary of State needs to be able to listen, not just speak. We've had Secretaries of State who apparently didn't understand that. And finally, the Secretary of State needs to be able to communicate to the American people and the Congress in terms that are understandable. Maybe not bumper sticker simple, but simple enough so that people can grasp what it is that what we are about internationally. Secretary Tillerson clearly has management ability. We don't know anything about the other three at this point, so we'll have to wait and see.
And of course, the other quality there, or attribute they both need to have, is the faith of the president.
At the moment, there's an octopus putting on socks.
So please join me in thanking Chas Freeman for